into the western desert. The desert stretches across the horizon in a quiet, unbroken expanse, a world of pale gold and soft ochre that seems to drift endlessly beneath a washed, sun-bleached sky. There is no wind at first, only the deep stillness that settles over the western desert of Egypt in the early hours of the morning. Heat has yet to gather its strength, and the sands lie cool, almost gentle, like a vast sleeping ocean. In this fragile hour between night and day, the silence carries a weight of its own, ancient and unmoving, as though it remembers things long forgotten. It is here, in this remote and haunting stretch of desert, that one of history's most enduring mysteries first took shape: the disappearance of an entire army, 50,000 men, according to classical tradition, swallowed by the dunes with no trace, no bones, no weapons, no scattered remnants of their long and impossible march. For more than 2 millennia, the story of Cambyses' lost army has lingered in the imagination of scholars, explorers, and desert wanderers. It has appeared in the writings of ancient historians, echoed in the accounts of priests of Amun, and whispered by the desert guides who still cross these sands in modern times. Tonight, the story begins slowly, as all great mysteries do with the land itself, for it is the western desert, stark and vast, that has shaped the legend more than any empire or king. The desert of ancient Egypt was not a place one crossed lightly. To the Egyptians, it was the realm of the Redlands, the Deshret, a domain of chaos, lying beyond the fertile banks of the Nile. To the Persians, it was a foreign land layered with meanings they did not fully understand, sacred oases, ancient oracles, and gods who answered in voices older than written language. And to the caravans and nomads who moved cautiously across its shifting plains, it was simply a world of unending tests, a place where the sun judged harshly, and the storms came without warning, sculpting ridges, burying valleys, and erasing footprints within moments. At the edge of this desert, the Persian Empire expanded its reach under Cambyses Skun, son of Cyrus the Great. The year was 525 BC, a moment when ancient powers collided with remarkable force. The Achaemenid Empire, already among the largest the world had ever seen, had driven its armies across Asia, subdued kingdoms, and brought diverse peoples under its control. Egypt, weakened by internal conflict and political fracturing, now lay exposed before the ambitions of Cambyses. His invasion would be swift, brutal, and decisive, reshaping the balance of power along the Mediterranean. Yet among these movements of armies and kings, one story stands apart, a strange episode preserved not in Persian chronicles, but in the words of Herodotus, the Greek historian who recorded the legends of many lands. According to Herodotus, after seizing Egypt's throne, Cambyses heard that the priests of Amun at the distant Siwa oasis had refused to acknowledge him as the rightful ruler. Their oracle, one of the most respected in the ancient world, had rejected his authority outright. Infuriated, Cambyses ordered a contingent of 50,000 soldiers to march across the desert and punish the sacred shrine. Herodotus tells us that these men vanished, not in battle, not in rebellion, but in a sandstorm so vast and violent that it consumed the entire army. No messenger returned. No fragment of armor was recovered. There was simply nothing. The story, preserved for centuries, feels at once mythic and strangely plausible. The western desert can indeed create storms powerful enough to reshape entire landscapes. But could such a storm engulf tens of thousands of soldiers? Could the sands bury their camp, their weapons, their bodies so completely that no trace remained? This is the mystery that has endured, one that begins with the geography itself, a geography as unforgiving as it is mesmerizing. In the early light, the desert reveals its subtle textures, rolling dunes that glitter faintly with mineral dust, low limestone plateaus eroded into pale cliffs and desolate basins where the wind gathers in restless spirals. It is a place of extremes, blinding sun by day, freezing temperatures by night, and sudden winds that rise like living things. Travelers in antiquity described it as a place where the world felt thinner, where landmarks disappeared behind mirages, and where silence itself could become overwhelming. Such a landscape was not merely a backdrop to the story, it was an actor in it. The desert could protect secrets for millennia. A single shift in the wind could alter an entire horizon. A burial beneath 30 feet of sand could last longer than empires. The Siwa oasis, the army's supposed destination, lay deep within this wilderness, nearly 500 kilometers from Memphis, and surrounded by barren, waterless expanses. Even experienced local tribes approached it cautiously, relying on wells' ancient roots and knowledge passed from generation to generation. For an invading army unfamiliar with these trails, the risks were immense. And yet Cambyses sent his troops anyway. Why was it truly anger toward the oracle, a need to demonstrate imperial authority? Or was there something more political, maneuvering internal dissent, or perhaps exaggeration in Herodotus's retelling? These questions have lingered for centuries, taken up by scholars who study the shifting sands for clues, and by explorers who hope that one day the desert might reveal what it has concealed for so long. For now, in this opening hour of the story, the desert remains silent. Its horizons stretch outward, endlessly serene. The sands give no hints, no whispers of what they have hidden. Instead, they present the same enigmatic face they have shown since antiquity, a reminder that the land itself holds the first piece of the puzzle. The story of the Lost Army begins not with Cambyses, nor with Herodotus, but with this vast expanse of earth and sky, a place where human ambition meets the enduring patience of nature. And as the light grows stronger, painting the dunes in shifting shades of gold, the mystery draws you in. It is a story of empire, faith, fury, and the fragile line between recorded history and the enduring unknown. This is the beginning of the tale, a soft descent into one of the ancient world's most haunting enigmas, where silence speaks and the sands remember what people have forgotten. Cambyses II and the Conquest of Egypt. The morning light lifts slowly over the Nile Valley, revealing a landscape very different from the barren western desert to the west. Here the world is green and alive, the river glimmering beneath the early sun, the fields dark with rich silt and palm groves swaying gently in the first warm breeze of the day. In 525 BC, this riverine kingdom stood as one of the oldest civilizations on Earth, a land shaped by ritual tradition and the memory of countless dynasties. But beneath its timeless appearance, Egypt was fragile. Pressure from foreign powers and internal divisions had weakened it, leaving the door open to a rising force from the east, the Persian Empire. To understand the mystery of Cambyses' lost army, the story must pass through this moment of political upheaval, the year when Egypt fell to Persia. Cambyses II, the son of Cyrus the Great, had inherited more than a throne. He had inherited an empire forged through relentless expansion. The Achaemenid realm stretched from the Aegean Sea to the Hindu Kush, from the steppes of Central Asia to the deserts of Arabia. Egypt, with its wealth, its religious prestige, and its long-standing independence, was a jewel the Persians could not ignore. The last native pharaoh of the 26th dynasty, Psamtik III, had ascended the throne barely 6 months before Cambyses began his campaign. He inherited a kingdom strained by decades of shifting alliances. Greek mercenaries guarded Egypt's borders, Libyan tribes formed the backbone of regional power, and the political elite struggled to maintain unity. Persia saw weakness and opportunity. Cambyses organized a massive invasion force gathering troops from across his empire. Persians, Medes, Semitic auxiliaries, and contingents from regions far beyond Egypt's horizon. The campaign began with a march through the deserts of the Sinai Peninsula, across a route where Egyptian control was thin. Persian envoys secured aid from Arab tribes whose expertise in desert travel was essential. Water caches were prepared. Wells were reinforced. The route, though perilous, was managed carefully, and for the ancient Egyptians the speed of Persia's advance was shocking. At Pelusium, near the northeastern edge of the delta, Cambyses fought the decisive battle. Ancient sources embellish the scene. Greek writers describe a massive engagement with catapult fire and dense formations. Egyptian inscriptions paint a picture of valiant resistance. But the outcome was clear. Egypt was defeated. Psamtik III retreated, fought once more near Memphis, and was ultimately captured. Cambyses entered Memphis not only as a conqueror, but as a foreign ruler stepping into one of the world's oldest thrones. But conquest is never a simple act of military triumph. In Egypt, the throne was sacred, intertwined with ritual and divine approval. A king did not merely rule, he maintained cosmic order. Persian kings who conquered Egypt had to adapt, adopting titles, offering sacrifices, and honoring the temples and the gods. Cambyses, according to Egyptian priests and later classical writers, struggled to navigate this delicate balance. Herodotus, writing a century later, painted Cambyses as volatile, often disrespectful toward Egyptian customs. Modern historians debate this image. Some view Herodotus's account as moralizing and exaggerated. Yet it is clear that tensions between Persian authority and Egypt's powerful priesthood ran deep. Temples were autonomous centers of wealth, influence, and tradition. Their leaders recognized no earthly ruler's legitimacy unless validated by the gods, particularly by Amun, whose oracle at the distant Siwa oasis carried enormous authority. And so the political stage was set. A newly conquered kingdom, a foreign king seeking to secure power, and religious centers whose acceptance was essential yet not guaranteed. The priests of Amun at Siwa reportedly refused to acknowledge Cambyses as the rightful ruler of Egypt. They refused him the divine legitimacy Egyptian tradition demanded. To Cambyses, emperor of one of the largest empires the world had ever seen, this rejection must have cut deeply. In the rigid hierarchy of the ancient Near East, religious defiance was not merely spiritual, it was political insubordination. Here the story bends toward the mysterious. According to Herodotus, enraged by the oracle's defiance, Cambyses ordered an entire division of his army, 50,000 men, to march westward across the desert and punish the sanctuary. The number is staggering: 50,000 soldiers, enough to overwhelm any settlement in the region. It would have been one of the largest organized troop movements into that part of the desert in antiquity. But such a march was also perilous. To send men into the western desert was to challenge nature itself. Experienced desert travelers knew the dangers intimately: water scarcity, disorienting horizons, and the ever-present risk of storms. Yet the legend tells us that Cambyses, driven by anger, or by a political need to demonstrate power, gave the order without hesitation. Some scholars argue that the story reflects political propaganda exaggerations crafted by Egyptian priests eager to portray Cambyses as impious. Others propose that the military detachment, if it existed, was small or perhaps a punitive force or a reconnaissance group. But the scale of the legend preserved over centuries suggests that the truth, whatever it may have been, left a lasting impression. What is certain is that the order marked the beginning of a journey into one of the most inhospitable regions in the ancient world, a journey from which no soldier would ever return. In the quiet after Egypt's conquest, as Persian rule settled uneasily over the Nile Valley, the story of the Lost Army began its long passage into history. It remains a haunting reminder that even the mightiest empires can be humbled by forces older and far more enduring than armies or kings. The Oracle at Siwa, Voice of Amun. The western desert widens again as the narrative shifts westward, carrying us away from the Nile's familiar green spine and into a realm shaped by silence and wind. Yet in the vast emptiness, one place stands apart, an improbably fertile basin deep within the limestone wilderness where groves of date palms rise from shimmering pools of fresh water and where for thousands of years a mysterious voice spoke on behalf of a god. This is the Siwa Oasis, a sanctuary that defied the desert. And in the 6th century BC, it was regarded as one of the most powerful spiritual centers in the ancient world. Amid the dunes, the cliffs, and the empty horizons, this oasis held the temple of Amun, whose oracle was believed to possess the insight of the divine. Before the legend of Cambyses' lost army can be understood, one must understand the profound importance of this place, and why its refusal to acknowledge a king could shake an empire. Siwa lies far from the Nile, separated by nearly 300 kilometers of open desert. To Egyptians, it was a remote frontier, accessible only by caravan trails, marked by scattered wells. To Libyan tribes, it was part of a network of oases, stretching westward, each holding a fragile balance of resources and survival. But to travelers who arrived seeking answers, Siwa was something else entirely, a world of shadows and cool breezes, where the harshness of the desert softened for a moment, and where the gods were said to whisper through sacred walls. The geography itself is striking. Approaching from the east, a traveler would see nothing but flat desert for days on end. Then, unexpectedly, the horizon would shift. Low ridges of pale rock would appear, followed by a sudden green shimmer, the telltale sign of life water and human settlement. The oasis is framed by natural salt lakes and ringed by clusters of palm trees with a fertile heart that could sustain a modest population. At its center stood the Temple of Amun, built upon a rocky rise known today as Agurmi. Constructed of local stone and mud brick, it was not as monumental as the temples of Thebes or Memphis, yet its influence reached far beyond its physical size. This was because of the oracle, the mysterious voice said to speak for Amun himself. Greek historians describe the Siwa oracle with reverence. Travelers from distant lands journeyed here to ask questions of fate, kings seeking legitimacy, generals asking about campaigns, and pilgrims searching for answers that could alter the course of their lives. Alexander the Great famously visited Siwa nearly 2 centuries after Cambyses emerging from the sanctuary, with the declaration that he was the son of Amun, a moment that reshaped his kingship. The oracle's authority rested upon ritual secrecy and tradition. Priests guided visitors through the sanctuary, their words echoing through dim chambers lit by flickering oil lamps. Ancient texts suggest that the god's voice was heard through subtle signs, the rustling of sacred trees, the movements of the priests, or the interpretations of dreams. These methods were enigmatic by design. Their power lay not in spectacle, but in the belief that the gods of Siwa were older, wiser, and untouched by the politics of empires. For the Egyptian priesthood, the oracle held legitimacy that even foreign rulers needed to respect. For Cambyses II, who had conquered Egypt and sought to establish his authority, the acceptance of Amun's priests would have been a symbolic seal, one that affirmed he was not merely a foreign conqueror, but a pharaoh in the eyes of the gods. Yet there was a problem. According to Herodotus, the oracle refused to recognize Cambyses as the rightful ruler. The priests of Amun rejected him, denying the spiritual approval that Egypt's political order demanded. The precise nature of this rejection is lost to time, but its implications would have been unmistakable. Without divine sanction, Cambyses risked being seen not as a legitimate king, but as an outsider, an intruder. This is where legend and history begin to blur. Herodotus describes Cambyses as reacting with fury, sending an army to destroy the sanctuary in retaliation. But modern historians question the simplicity of this narrative. The priests of Siwa had little to do with the centers of Egyptian administration. Their influence was spiritual, not military. So why would Cambyses take such a drastic step? Some argue that Herodotus exaggerated the story, borrowing from Egyptian oral traditions hostile to Persian rule. Others suggest that Cambyses might have been attempting to secure control of the western frontier by subduing or intimidating the Libyan tribes. Still others propose that the army he sent may not have been 50,000 soldiers, but rather a smaller contingent of scouts envoys or punitive forces. Yet the core of the legend, the sending of troops toward Siwa, persists across traditions, and that persistence suggests that something significant occurred. Perhaps Cambyses sought to assert dominance over a region that had never accepted foreign control. Perhaps he feared rebellion supported by the Libyan tribes. Or perhaps the rejection by the oracle, whether real or imagined, struck at a deeper cultural nerve. In ancient Egypt, kingship was not merely political, it was cosmic. A ruler who lacked divine blessing threatened the natural order. The idea that the god Amun had denied a king would have been a powerful story to the people of Egypt, one that could undermine Persian rule from the moment it began. Thus the stage was set for a confrontation between empire and faith, between earthly power and divine authority. And somewhere within this tension and stand the decision to march an army westward across the most treacherous landscape in North Africa. The desert does not reveal its secrets easily. Yet the story of Cambyses' lost army begins here, amid the cool waters and sacred groves of Siwa, a place where the voice of a god once echoed, shaping the ambitions and fears of kings. In the quiet hours of the night, when the winds still, one can imagine the priests ascending the temple steps, murmuring prayers to Amun, unaware that far across the dunes an army was being assembled, one whose fate would soon be swallowed by the sands. The oasis remains today peaceful and enduring, its ancient temple standing against the sky. Visitors still walk among its ruins, feeling the weight of the desert around them, sensing that this was once a place where the boundary between the human and the divine felt thin. And it was from here, from this small but powerful sanctuary, that a legend was born, a legend of refusal of divine judgment and of an army destined never to return. The order to march. The story shifts now to the Persian court in Memphis, a city still adjusting to the rhythms of foreign rule. It is a tense period, a moment when newly conquered Egypt lies unsettled beneath the weight of an unfamiliar empire. The palaces and storerooms are filled with soldiers, officials, translators, and emissaries, each contributing to the uneasy machinery of occupation. And somewhere within this atmosphere of suspicion and fragile authority, the order was given, an order that would send tens of thousands of men into the desert, beginning one of the most enduring mysteries of the ancient world. To imagine the moment when Cambyses II commanded the march towards Siwa is to imagine a convergence of political pressure, personal pride, and cultural misunderstanding. According to Herodotus, the story is simple, angered by the oracle's refusal to acknowledge him as the rightful pharaoh. Cambyses dispatched 50,000 troops to destroy the sanctuary. But history, rarely so neat, invites deeper reflection. The Persian Empire was built on a foundation of disciplined administration and strategic warfare. Yet it was also a multicultural empire containing dozens of peoples with their own traditions and rivalries. For Cambyses, newly seated on a throne that required divine validation in the eyes of the Egyptians, the rejection from the oracle of Amun would have been more than an insult. It would have been a threat to the legitimacy of his rule. In the ancient Near East, divine displeasure could undermine a king's authority as effectively as rebellion or invasion. Thus, the order, if it was indeed given as Herodotus describes, must be seen within the wider context of imperial control. A king who failed to suppress dissent, especially dissent couched in religious authority, risked appearing weak before both his subjects and his own court. The decision to march troops toward the Siwa oasis may have been an attempt to demonstrate strength to affirm Persian authority over every corner of Egypt. Yet there is another layer to this moment, for the Persian court was not a unified chorus. It was a complex environment of advisors, officers, satrapal administrators, and foreign commanders. Greek mercenaries served alongside Persian cavalry, Egyptian scribes translated orders, court officials from distant provinces expected to see their ruler act with decisive clarity. Any perception of hesitation or vulnerability could spark internal challenges. Within this environment, the figure of Cambyses himself remains elusive. Herodotus portrays him as rash and quick-tempered, driven more by impulse than reason. Modern scholars, however, see a more nuanced picture, a capable ruler whose mistakes were magnified by hostile Egyptian sources and Greek storytelling. The truth likely lies somewhere in between. Cambyses was a conqueror, but he was also a man navigating the unfamiliar religious landscape of Egypt, attempting to impose order in a kingdom shaped by traditions far older than Persia itself. Against this backdrop, the question of the army's size arises. Was it truly 50,000 men? The number is possible, but it is enormous, more typical of large-scale campaigns than punitive expeditions. Persian armies were known for flexibility, organizing forces based on terrain threat and strategic objectives. Marching 50,000 soldiers into the desert would have required vast logistical support, water carriers supply animals, guides, interpreters, and engineers. To sustain such a force across hundreds of kilometers of barren desert would have been a monumental task. Some historians suggest that the original expedition may have been much smaller, perhaps a few thousand troops, or even a large detachment of scouts or envoys. Over time, as the story passed through generations of Egyptian priests, Greek historians, and local desert tribes, the numbers may have grown transforming a modest expedition into the legendary army of 50,000. The exaggeration would have served several purposes, emphasizing Cambyses' hubris, magnifying the role of divine punishment, or reinforcing Siwa's spiritual prestige. Other scholars take the traditional number more seriously, arguing that Cambyses might have intended to subdue not only the oasis, but the surrounding Libyan tribes whose alliances could threaten Persian control. A large force may have been necessary to project imperial strength far beyond the Nile Valley. Whatever the size, the nature of the order is clear. The troops were to depart westward, crossing some of the harshest terrain in North Africa. The desert beyond the Nile was not a blank space on Persian maps, but it was perilously close to the limits of imperial knowledge. Beyond a few established caravan trails, the region was dominated by nomadic tribes whose pathways shifted with the seasons. Even local guides often depended on experience passed down across generations, knowledge of hidden wells, dangerous cliffs, and subtle landmarks nearly invisible to outsiders, and so the army assembled infantry units from various provinces, cavalry accustomed to open-terrain supply carriers burdened with waterskins and grain. The preparations must have seemed hurried, pressured by the king's will, and by the need to respond swiftly to perceived defiance. Persian administrators recorded provisions, arranged escorts, and gathered interpreters. Egyptian officials, newly subordinated, may have provided regional knowledge, or may have offered it reluctantly, unwilling to aid a mission that appeared sacrilegious. Then came the moment of departure. The soldiers marched out of Memphis, crossing the cultivated fields westward, until the green world of the Nile gave way to the muted, wind-sculpted tones of the desert. Their route is unknown, but it must have taken them past the last settlements, the last wells, and the final outposts of Persian control. Beyond that point stretched the Deshret, the Red Land, where the desert carved silence into every horizon. It is here at the threshold of the unknown that the mystery truly begins. The order to march, born of political tension and religious defiance, set in motion an event that would fade into legend almost as soon as it occurred. For what happened after the army left the fertile valleys of Egypt remains uncertain, preserved only in fragments of ancient writing and the whispered stories of desert tribes. Yet even in this moment, at the very beginning of their journey, the seeds of uncertainty are palpable. Did the soldiers realize the scale of the danger ahead? Did they place their trust in the guides? Did they carry enough water? Did they fear the wrath of a god whose sanctuary they were sent to destroy? History does not answer. The desert, patient and vast, swallowed the details. What remains is the echo of the king's command, a single moment of imperial will that sent thousands into the wilderness, leaving behind one of the most haunting enigmas of antiquity. The route into the sands. The desert rises before them in muted waves of pale gold and wind-scoured stone, an immense frontier stretching westward toward Siwa. For the soldiers of Cambyses, this was not a symbolic landscape. It was an obstacle, a test, a silent opponent, more powerful than any army they had faced. To understand the fate of the lost Persian contingent, historians must attempt what the ancient chroniclers never fully described, reconstruct the route they likely took step by step into one of the most inhospitable regions in North Africa. The departure point was almost certainly somewhere near the edge of the Nile Valley west of Memphis, or one of its outlying garrisons. From the moment the army left the last green fields behind, its survival depended entirely on water navigation and luck. The western desert is not a uniform expanse of sand. It is a mosaic of shifting dunes, gravel plains, limestone plateaus and scattered depressions that gather heat like great stone bowls. There are no broad rivers, no shaded corridors. Landmarks are subtle, sometimes invisible, beneath the glare of the sun. Ancient desert travelers relied on an intricate network of trails paths, worn by caravans and Libyan tribes who understood the seasonal rhythms of this unforgiving terrain. These routes were not chosen arbitrarily. They followed Wells rock formations and wind channels that offered minimal shelter from the elements. For Cambyses' army, several possible paths emerged from geographical and archaeological research, each presenting its own mix of danger and feasibility. The northern coastal route was the most logical and stable of the ancient trails. It followed a string of oases and water sources that paralleled the Mediterranean coastline, passing through regions inhabited by Libyan tribes who traded with Egypt. This route, while long, offered periodic access to wells and natural basins, but it also demanded a careful balance of diplomacy and force. The tribes along this corridor were fiercely independent, and any large foreign army moving through their territory risked provocation. Scholars who support this northern route theory point out that it minimized exposure to the deep desert's more deadly environments. Another possibility was the central route cutting across the Bahariya Depression before bending southwest toward Siwa. Bahariya, though far from the Nile, was a well-established oasis even in antiquity, with watershade and settlements capable of sustaining travelers. If the army had passed through Bahariya, it would have found brief respite, a chance to replenish its stores before undertaking the final, most dangerous stretch. The problem with this theory is the distance. The central route demanded a longer journey across regions with fewer natural markers. Without skilled guides, an army could easily become disoriented. Then there was the southern route, the most perilous and least likely, a vast sweep through the Great Sand Sea, a region of towering dunes that shift with the rhythm of the wind. Even seasoned desert caravans avoided this route except during times of unusual necessity. The sands here are soft, unstable, and shaped by storms that can rise with almost no warning. To march 50,000 men across such terrain would have been almost suicidal unless they possessed exceptional knowledge of the land. Yet some scholars argue that Cambyses' army might have attempted a path near the northern edge of the Great Sand Sea, where the dunes give way to gravel plains. This would have placed them closer to Siwa, but it also exposed them to meteorological hazards far more intense than those found along the coastal route. Whichever path they chose, the army would have faced immense logistical demands. The Persians were not strangers to desert warfare. They had crossed the arid expanses of Iran and the Levant, but the western desert was different. Here the distance between oases was extreme. Water sources were sometimes seasonal, unreliable, or known only to local tribes. A well that sustained a caravan of 50 men could not support an army of thousands. Every stage of the march required careful calculation. Every mistake carried consequences that multiplied with terrifying speed. Archaeologists studying ancient desert routes note that certain trails leave subtle traces, the remains of hearths, fragmented pottery from water jars, and faint depressions in the ground where heavy loads once passed. But the western desert's shifting sands erase many of these clues. Wind moves dunes overnight. Limestone surfaces erode under centuries of temperature swings. The result is a landscape that actively resists giving up its secrets. To imagine the march, one must see the desert as the soldiers saw it. long columns of infantry stepping into a horizon that never changes, the sun rising higher, draining moisture from lips and throats, camels laden with water skins trudging ahead, their shadows shrinking beneath them, officers scanning the horizon for landmarks, a solitary hill, a dark outcropping, a distant line of palms indicating water. At night, the desert turns cold. The soldiers would have lit fires where possible, using animal dung or sparse brush collected during the day. The stars above them would have been brilliant, sharp, and vast, offering both comfort and disorientation. In such silence, one might hear the faint hiss of sand shifting under the wind, a reminder that the terrain itself was always in motion. The further west they marched, the more fragile their situation became. Supplies dwindled. Navigation became a matter not only of skill, but of endurance. Even minor deviations from the intended path could lead the column into regions where no water existed at all. Local guides, likely hired or coerced by the Persians, would have been essential. Their knowledge of wells and desert markers could mean the difference between life and death. But guides, too, could be fallible or resistant if their loyalties lay with the tribes hostile to Persian intrusion. It is in this delicate interplay between geography, navigation, and survival that historians see the first cracks in the army's fate. Long before the sandstorm of legend, long before the moment they supposedly vanished, the soldiers were walking into a region that punished even the smallest misstep. In the desert, there is no wasted choice, no margin for error. When water runs low, time itself becomes an enemy. When a guide misjudges a route, the horizon becomes a threat. And when the wind begins to rise, bringing with it the first grains of sand, an army of thousands can be reduced to helplessness. Thus, the route into the sands was not merely a path, it was a test. One that required knowledge the Persians did not possess, resources they may not have carried, and caution they may not have exercised. The stage was set. Ahead lay the deeper desert, and with it the forces that would eventually erase an entire army from the record of history. The desert that devours. The deeper the army moved into the western desert, the more the landscape transformed into something otherworldly, a realm where nature seemed to test the limits of human endurance. While the Nile Valley offered the comfort of running watershade and fertile soil, the desert beyond radiated an unforgiving stillness. The sands stretched outward like a pale sea frozen in eternal motion, shaped by forces older than the kingdoms that rose and fell along its borders. If the soldiers of Cambyses felt small before the empire they served, they now faced a far more ancient and indifferent power, the desert itself. To grasp the enormity of what awaited them, it is essential to understand the western desert not as a simple expanse of sand, but as a vast geological system alive with hidden dangers. Beneath its quiet surface lay conditions capable of destroying entire caravans, swallowing roads, and erasing history. For thousands of years, the Egyptians and Libyan tribes respected this terrain, approaching it with caution and humility. To outsiders, however, its dangers were not always obvious, at least not until it was too late. One of the most formidable threats came in the form of the Khamsin, the desert wind that sweeps across North Africa with a force both mesmerizing and terrifying. The name itself means 50, referring to the roughly 50 days each year when these storms commonly strike. Rising from the south and west, a Khamsin can transform a calm horizon into a churning wall of sand. The air heats rapidly, sometimes leaping by 20 degrees within an hour. Visibility collapses, darkness falls in the middle of day, breath becomes a struggle, each inhalation filled with fine dust that clings to the throat and lungs. Modern travelers who have experienced even mild versions of these storms describe the sensation as like being inside a furnace, the wind pressing against every surface, the sand stinging like needles. Ancient armies equipped with minimal protection would have been far more vulnerable. A column could lose its cohesion in minutes, its members scattered and blinded. Animals might panic, supplies could be lost, and the rhythmic structure that defines military movement would dissolve. Yet the Khamsin was only one hazard. The great sand sea to the southwest, a region of towering dunes and soft shifting slopes, presented a challenge that wrong-footed even the most experienced desert traders. Dunes here could reach over 100 meters in height. Their arrangement, reshaped by seasonal winds, could turn familiar routes into disorienting mazes. The sands themselves behaved like a living surface, prone to sudden shifts. When the wind blew strongly for days at a time, dunes migrated, covering old pathways and uncovering features long buried. Such changes could erase the tracks of an army almost instantly. Without clear landmarks, even expert guides risked losing their way. And for soldiers who depended on a consistent supply route leading back to the Nile, a single navigational error could cascade into catastrophe. The desert also possessed optical illusions capable of deceiving even seasoned travelers. Mirage phenomena created by the temperature gradient between hot sand and cooler air painted shimmering images of distant lakes or clusters of trees, enticing visions of relief that vanished upon approach. For an army suffering from dehydration and fatigue, mirages could lure scouts and columns off their intended path, wasting precious time and energy. Then there were the wadis, the shallow, dry riverbeds that cut across the landscape like pale scars. Though they offered easier walking terrain, wadis also funneled wind in unexpected ways, creating sudden gusts and miniature sand vortices. In rare rainfall events typically confined to the northern fringe, these channels could flood without warning. A sudden torrent could sweep through low-lying areas, drowning fires, washing away stored supplies, and leaving behind impotence in the face of nature's unpredictable rhythms. Amid these challenges, the desert's most subtle weapon was its silence. Days might pass without incident. The sun would rise, burn, and fall. The night would bring coolness but little relief from exhaustion. In such prolonged quiet, the environment became psychologically taxing. Soldiers marching for hours under an unchanging sky sometimes reported losing their sense of direction. Prolonged exposure to the uniform landscape produced a feeling of drifting through an endless, featureless world, a sensation that heightened fear and dulled judgment. Caravans that crossed these expanses learned to respect the land, traveling only under certain conditions, resting during the hottest hours, and navigating by a delicate network of stone markers and oral tradition. A massive army, however, could not move with the same agility or caution. Its sheer size magnified every miscalculation. Another critical consideration is the water economy of the region. Oases were rare and their wells finite. A single misjudgment in distance or timing could cause an entire force to exhaust its supply. Water carried in skins could leak, spoil, or be lost in storms. Animals needed water as well, and without it, the burden of carrying supplies fell entirely upon the soldiers. In the western desert, thirst could strike quickly and brutally, worsening morale and impairing decision-making. Desert tribes survived because their knowledge of water sources was intimate, passed down through generations. Cambyses' army, even with local guides, would have been perilously dependent on this fragile knowledge. If those guides were unreliable, whether accidentally or intentionally, the consequences could be devastating. Finally, one must consider the geological nature of burial in the desert. The sand does not merely cover objects, it integrates them. Metal corrodes rapidly in certain conditions. Bones exposed to extreme temperature swings become brittle. A body buried beneath a meter of wind-blown sand might be preserved for decades, only to be shattered by erosion centuries later. Over centuries, dunes repeatedly bury and uncover the same areas, grinding remains into fragments too small to identify. For an entire army to vanish, the desert needed no malice. It required only time, wind, and silence. And this is what makes the story of Cambyses' army so compelling. The mechanisms by which they might have disappeared are neither fantastical nor supernatural. They are deeply natural, rooted in the rhythmic violence and quiet patience of the desert itself. By the time the soldiers reached the deeper regions toward Siwa, they were marching into a landscape that had always swallowed human ambition. Whether the army faced a sandstorm, lost its way, or encountered a perfect alignment of multiple hazards remains uncertain, but the environment they entered was capable of erasing their traces with a thoroughness that defies imagination. The Western Desert does not simply challenge those who cross it. It consumes, reshapes, and remembers differently than the world of rivers and cities. In this realm, catastrophe can leave no visible scar. And this is why the mystery endures, why the lost army remains lost, because the desert that devours leaves behind only silence. Herodotus and the birth of the legend. The story of Cambyses' vanished army might have dissolved entirely into the desert winds, were it not for one man, a traveler chronicler and storyteller from the Greek city of Halicarnassus. Herodotus, often called the father of history, journeyed through Egypt in the mid-5th century BC, nearly a century after the Persian conquest. It is through his words that the tale of the lost army reached the wider world, preserved not as a footnote of military misfortune, but as a haunting legend woven into the cultural memory of antiquity. To understand how this story became one of history's most enduring mysteries, one must return to Herodotus's travels and the world he encountered. Herodotus entered Egypt at a time when the land was under Persian rule, but its culture and religious traditions remained vibrant. The temples along the Nile stood as repositories of ancient knowledge. Their priests served not only as spiritual guides, but as historians, astronomers, and storytellers. Greek visitors often marveled at Egypt's antiquity. They saw in its monuments and rituals a wisdom far older than their own traditions. For Herodotus, Egypt became a source of both fascination and information. During his time there, he recorded tales passed down through generations of priests, stories of kings, battles, miracles, and catastrophes. Among these accounts was the story of the army Cambyses sent across the desert to punish the oracle at Siwa. Herodotus describes the event in his Histories, a text that blends direct observation, hearsay, and cultural insight. According to him, after conquering Egypt and learning that the priests of Amun refused to recognize him as Pharaoh Cambyses, ordered 50,000 men to march toward the oasis. The army reached the city of Thebes, crossed the desert as far as the oasis of Karga, and prepared to continue toward Siwa. But along the way, somewhere between Karga and the final stretch of barren wilderness, the desert rose against them. A great sandstorm swept across their path. Herodotus says simply and chillingly that they were entombed by the winds. This is the earliest known written account of the Lost Army, and its simplicity lends it a haunting power. Herodotus does not describe the battle or the soldiers' final moments. He does not dramatize their suffering. Instead, he offers a stark image, an army swallowed whole by the desert, never to be seen again. Yet modern historians must ask, how reliable is this account? Herodotus is a foundational figure in the study of history, but his methods differ greatly from modern standards. He combined eyewitness accounts with stories he heard from priests, merchants, and guides. He often relayed multiple versions of an event, leaving readers to decide which seemed most plausible. His purpose was not merely to record facts, but to capture the cultural meaning of events, to weave together the fabric of human experience as told by various peoples. His work reflects his curiosity, but also the limitations of his sources. Egyptian priests, particularly those resentful of Persian rule, may have shaped their stories to portray Cambyses in a negative light. By the time Herodotus visited Egypt, memories of the Persian invasion were still sharp, and oral tradition tends to intensify dramatic episodes. The story of an army destroyed by the desert could have served as a moral lesson, a warning about the consequences of challenging the gods. Some scholars argue that Herodotus's account was influenced by Egyptian hostility toward Cambyses. He is often depicted in their stories as a tyrant who desecrated temples, mocked sacred rituals, and disrespected the gods. Whether these stories reflect reality or were part of a narrative crafted by a conquered people remains a matter of debate. But to dismiss Herodotus entirely would be equally misguided. His accounts often contain kernels of truth, even when embroidered by time. He traveled extensively, cross-examined his sources, and openly expressed skepticism when stories seemed exaggerated. In the case of the Lost Army, he offers the version he heard most often from Egyptian priests, suggesting that the tale was widely accepted throughout Egypt. There is also the broader context to consider. Sandstorms capable of burying large numbers of people do occur. Caravans have vanished in deserts across Africa and Asia, sometimes without leaving a trace. The Western desert's geology and meteorology are fully capable of producing such an event. Herodotus's account may not be exact, but it is not implausible. What Herodotus provides more than strict historical detail is the framework through which later generations understood the mystery. His telling shaped the cultural imagination. Greek philosophers referenced the Lost Army as a cautionary story about pride. Roman writers cited it as an example of nature's supremacy over human ambition. Later medieval geographers incorporated the tale into their descriptions of Africa's deserts, repeating it as established knowledge. Through Herodotus, the Lost Army became a legend, not simply an event, but a symbol. It represented the point at which the ambitions of an empire collided with the raw power of the natural world. The image of soldiers marching bravely into a wall of sand carried a timeless allure. It evoked both wonder and fear, reminding readers that some mysteries are created not by human design, but by the earth itself. And yet, for all its enduring power, the account leaves crucial questions unanswered. Did Herodotus misinterpret an event conveyed by the priests? Did the soldiers perish in a storm, or did they succumb to thirst, confusion, or conflict with local tribes? Were the priests of Amun using the story to warn against foreign arrogance, or was the army's disappearance embellished to elevate Siwa's authority, Herodotus does not provide enough detail to answer these questions, but by preserving the story, he ensured that scholars, explorers, and dreamers would continue searching for answers long after the sands had settled over the army's fate. Thus, the legend became part of the historical record, not through the precision of measurement, but through the weight of storytelling. A single passage in the histories carried the tale across centuries, allowing the mystery to travel far beyond Egypt. The desert, silent as it is, does not speak. But Herodotus gave the desert a voice, and that voice continues to echo across time. Archaeologists enter the desert. For more than 2,000 years after Herodotus recorded the tale of Cambyses' vanished army, the western desert remained largely untouched by systematic exploration. Caravans passed through its oases, desert tribes maintained their hidden roots, and the sands shifted in their ancient rhythms. The story of the Lost Army drifted through centuries as legend repeated by scholars and travelers, yet never tested against the landscape itself. It was not until the 19th century, an age of rediscovery, scientific curiosity, and European fascination with the ancient world, that archaeologists began to turn their attention toward the desert in earnest. What drew them was not only the mystery of Cambyses' missing soldiers, but a broader desire to map, measure, and understand the forgotten spaces of antiquity. Egyptology was emerging as a discipline. The decipherment of hieroglyphics had unlocked thousands of years of history. The Nile Valley, once known only through classical sources, now yielded temples, papyri, tombs, and entire cities. Against this background of excitement, the western desert beckoned with its own unanswered questions. The first explorers who ventured west were not searching specifically for the lost army. They were mapping trade routes, identifying ancient settlements, and documenting the oases that once connected Egypt to Libya. But inevitably, the legend of Cambyses accompanied them. In the isolated settlements of Baharia Farafra and Dakhla, whispers of the old story persisted. Guides spoke of bones beneath the sand, of weapons uncovered after storms, and of ancient travelers who vanished without a trace. Among the earliest systematic investigators were 19th-century British and German explorers, men whose journals combined scientific observation with romantic description. They set out with local guides armed with compasses, notebooks, and heavy canvas water bags. Their expeditions often faced the same challenges that had plagued ancient travelers: the difficulty of navigation, the scarcity of reliable wells, and the unpredictability of desert storms. These early archaeologists rarely found anything that could be definitively linked to the Lost Army. But they did notice something else: the desert's extraordinary capacity to conceal. Sand-covered layers of history, sometimes burying entire settlements so thoroughly that only a fragment of pottery or a single stone wall peeked out from beneath the dunes. This insight deepened the mystery. If the desert could engulf villages and temples, could it not swallow an army as well? By the late 19th century, Western interest in the Lost Army grew more focused. The writings of Herodotus were widely circulated, and the rise of academic archaeology encouraged more ambitious expeditions. Scholars debated the likely route of the army, mapping hypothetical paths from Memphis to Siwa. They studied the logistics of ancient warfare, the distances between wells, and the placement of caravan trails. The mystery moved from the realm of legend into the realm of academic inquiry. One of the most influential figures of this period was George Alexander Lawrence, a British military cartographer who traveled extensively in the desert during the 1860s. Although not an archaeologist in the modern sense, Lawrence documented the terrain with remarkable precision. His notes on dune movement, wind patterns, and water sources provided a new scientific foundation for understanding how an army might vanish under such conditions. In the early 20th century, another wave of explorers took up the challenge. These were years of great archaeological discoveries: Tutankhamun's tomb, the Valley of the Golden Mummies, and the systematic excavation of ancient cities. The Lost Army stood out among the many mysteries whispered in the halls of universities and museums. Yet, even as interest grew, searching for the army remained a daunting task. The Western Desert covers nearly 2 million square kilometers, an area larger than many modern nations. To search for remains in such vastness is to look for a handful of needles in an ocean of shifting sand. Moreover, the desert provides few stable landmarks. A dune seen today may be gone tomorrow. A well-documented depression may lie beneath meters of new sand within a year. This dynamic environment challenged archaeologists at every turn. Still work continued. Excavations near ancient oases uncovered pottery tools, burial sites, and fragments of long-lost trade networks. These findings illuminated the broader history of the desert, revealing that it was not a barren wasteland, but a region shaped by human movement and settlement. Though none of these discoveries resolved the mystery of the Lost Army, they prove that life and death had long played out across these sands. By mid-century, archaeologists began employing aerial photography, a technique that revealed patterns invisible from the ground. Lines of old caravan routes became faint traces on the landscape. Dry riverbeds emerged from beneath the dunes as pale scars. Yet no formation resembling a mass burial or abandoned campsite appeared. The desert revealed many secrets, but not the one researchers sought most. It was during this period that the first modern claims of finding the army began to surface, claims that would later fuel controversy, skepticism, and debate. Explorers in Libya and Egypt occasionally reported discovering skeletal remains, fragments of metal, or arrowheads. But these findings were often isolated, lacking context, and easily explained by other historical events. The desert had been crossed by numerous armies over thousands of years. Without definitive evidence, inscriptions, distinctive Persian armor, or mass graves, no discovery could be confidently linked to Cambyses. Even so, the idea that the army might one day be found captured the public imagination. Newspapers ran articles speculating about the exact location. Popular magazines illustrated dramatic scenes of soldiers disappearing into sandstorms, their silhouettes fading behind walls of wind. The legend took on a life that blended scholarship with storytelling, fact with speculation. As the 20th century advanced, archaeologists grew more cautious. They recognized how easily the desert could mislead. Sandstorms might expose human remains from unrelated eras. Metal objects could be transported by wind or water across long distances. Without systematic excavation, no isolated discovery could be trusted. Nonetheless, the early explorers had accomplished something vital. They brought the Lost Army into the realm of scientific inquiry. What had once been a tale preserved by Herodotus and echoed by Egyptian priests became a legitimate historical question, a puzzle that demanded careful examination, skepticism, and patience. They also helped illuminate a deeper truth that the desert's silence is not emptiness, but a veil. Beneath its shifting surface lies a palimpsest of civilizations, battles, migrations, and forgotten lives. Finding the lost army would require not only luck, but an understanding of the desert as a living system constantly reshaping itself. And so the search continued into the remote dunes of Libya, the wind-sculpted hills near Siwa, and the gravel plains that stretched toward the Sahara's heart. Each expedition brought new data, but none brought certainty. The mystery endured, protected by the sands. The László Almási expedition. By the early 20th century, the mystery of Cambyses' lost army had grown from a whispered legend into a question pursued by explorers, desert cartographers, colonial officers, and scholars alike. Yet no one had made a claim bold enough to challenge the silence of the sands until the Hungarian explorer Count László Almási, a man whose life would later inspire the novel The English Patient, turned his attention toward the western desert. Almási was not an archaeologist in the formal sense. He was a pilot, a desert navigator, and one of the most skilled explorers of the Sahara in the interwar years. His understanding of dune systems, ancient caravan routes, and lost valleys far surpassed that of many scholars of his time. To Almási, the desert was not an empty space, but a vast, dynamic world filled with patterns, shapes, and pathways invisible to ordinary travelers. He had crossed the Gilf Kabir Plateau, traced forgotten tracks beneath the dunes, and mapped regions previously unknown to European explorers. In the 1930s, he believed he could do something no one else had managed: find evidence of Cambyses' vanished army. The idea took root as Almási studied the accounts of Herodotus' early explorers and the topography of the desert. He suspected that previous archaeological searches had been hampered by incorrect assumptions about the army's route. Most explorers focused on the well-trodden central and northern paths leading from the Nile toward Siwa, but Almási proposed that the soldiers may have taken a more southerly, more treacherous route, skirting the Great Sand Sea. This path, in his view, offered a more direct line from Thebes or Karga toward Siwa, and passed through regions where sandstorms and dune migration were especially severe. Armed with this hypothesis, Almási led multiple expeditions into the desert between 1932 and 1936. His approach combined modern technology with traditional desert knowledge. He used automobiles fitted with wide tires, carried radios, and worked alongside skilled local guides who understood the desert's subtleties. He also employed aerial reconnaissance, flying over immense stretches of dunes to search for anomalies, unusual shapes, linear depressions, or dark patches on the sand that might indicate buried structures or ancient encampments. It was during one of these expeditions that Almási made the claim that electrified the public imagination. While exploring near the Libyan-Egyptian border, he reported discovering a cluster of human bones fragments of metal and the remains of what appeared to be ancient campfires. The entire area was partially exposed by recent winds, as though the desert had momentarily lifted its veil. Almási believed he had found the first tangible clues to the fate of the lost army. Newspapers across Europe seized the story. Headlines declared that the sands had finally given up their secret. Illustrators depicted dramatic scenes of Persian soldiers sinking into storms of golden dust. Yet when scholars examined Almási's reports, skepticism grew. The bones he described were scattered irregularly with no clear pattern of mass burial. Some were animal remains. Others had no identifiable cultural markers. The metal fragments could not be conclusively dated. The alleged campfire sites, upon closer inspection, lacked the ash or burned stone typical of ancient encampments. Most importantly, Almási had not conducted a formal excavation. The desert winds could easily have transported the bones from distant locations. Without stratigraphic analysis, an essential archaeological tool context was impossible to establish. But Almási was undeterred. He believed the shifting sands had exposed only a small portion of a larger site. In his writings, he described the Western Desert as a vast, restless archive that occasionally revealed fragments of forgotten histories. To him, the scattered bones were signs that a deeper layer remained hidden just beneath the dunes. The outbreak of World War II interrupted further exploration. Almási's complex political life, including his connections with both British and German intelligence, cast a long shadow over his desert research. After the war, he attempted to return to Libya to resume his search, but political instability made expeditions increasingly difficult. He died in 1951, his claims unverified, his evidence unaccepted by the scholarly community. Yet the Almási expeditions left a lasting legacy. They demonstrated how easily the desert could deceive the eye. What seemed like the remnants of an army could be random scatterings of material carried across long distances by wind or intermittent floods. A cluster of bones without context told no story. A patch of metal might be ancient or might be modern debris from nomads or travelers. Still, Almási's boldness reignited global fascination with the Lost Army. His theories forced archaeologists to reconsider long-held assumptions. They recognized that the desert's southern regions, particularly near the edge of the Great Sand Sea, had been underexplored. They acknowledged that the Army's route could not be traced solely through historical texts. It had to be reconstructed with the combined tools of geology, climatology, and archaeological surveying. Almási's work also inspired later desert explorers, such as Egyptologist Ahmed Fakhri and Italian archaeologist Carlo Bergman, both of whom investigated similar regions and documented ancient routes, rock shelters, and caravan networks. Though they never found evidence of Cambyses' army, their work expanded understanding of the desert's deep history and revealed new insights into the lives of the people who once crossed these harsh expanses. In the end, the László Almási expeditions occupy an unusual place in the story of the Lost Army. They represent a moment when the mystery came close to physical discovery, or seemed to. They also exemplify the challenges of desert archaeology, the difficulty of excavation, the fragility of evidence, and the tendency of the sands to borrow, displace, and erase. Almási's claimed findings remain unproven, yet his vision of an army swallowed by the desert waiting beneath the dunes still resonates. It blends scientific curiosity with human fascination, reminding us that some mysteries tempt explorers not because they promise certainty, but because they offer the possibility of glimpsing a forgotten moment in the grand shifting theater of the desert. His failure to produce definitive evidence did not diminish the legend. In some ways, it strengthened it. The desert, uninterested in human ambition, merely closed its veil again, leaving behind whispers caught in the wind. Alternative historical theories. By the time the 20th century drew to a close, the mystery of Cambyses' lost army had become one of the most debated enigmas in ancient history. Archaeological expeditions had searched the dunes. Historians had combed through Persian, Egyptian, and Greek records. Explorers had proposed new routes, and desert scientists had mapped wind patterns across thousands of square kilometers. Yet no definitive evidence had surfaced. No armor, no mass graves, no abandoned camp, nothing to confirm the dramatic tale preserved by Herodotus. In the absence of physical proof, the academic landscape opened to a range of alternative theories, each attempting to explain what might have happened between the moment Cambyses gave his infamous order and the point at which the army vanished from the historical record. These theories vary widely, from skeptical interpretations that dismiss the basic premise of the story to nuanced reconstructions rooted in logistics, geography, and cultural politics. To understand the full spectrum of possibilities, each must be examined with the same calm, patient lens through which we view the desert itself. Theory 1. The army never existed, a priestly invention. Some historians argue that the entire episode may have been fabricated by Egyptian priests who were hostile to Persian rule and eager to portray Cambyses as impious, reckless, and cursed. In this interpretation, the Lost Army functions as a moral tale. A foreign king defies the gods and suffers divine punishment. This theory draws strength from the broader narrative tradition of ancient Egypt, where stories often served symbolic purposes. The priests of Amun, angered by Cambyses' intrusion into their spiritual domain and his attempts to control temple wealth, may have shaped the story to reinforce their authority and undermine the legitimacy of foreign rulers. Herodotus himself acknowledges the possibility of exaggeration in Egyptian accounts, noting that priests were skilled storytellers. They may have woven together fragments of older myths, combining them with contemporary political tensions to craft a narrative that casts the Persian king as a villain punished by Amun. If this theory is correct, then the Lost Army is not a historical event at all, but a theological parable, one that endured because it resonated so strongly with Egypt's cultural worldview. Theory 2. A much smaller force was lost, later exaggerated. Another plausible interpretation holds that Cambyses did indeed send troops toward Siwa, but that the contingent was far smaller than the legendary 50,000. Perhaps a detachment of a few hundred soldiers, scouts, messengers, or an elite unit set out to intimidate or negotiate with the oasis. Such an expedition might easily have perished in a sandstorm or failed to locate the crucial wells required for survival. Over time, the memory of this small loss could have grown through oral tradition. Priests retelling the story may have increased the numbers to emphasize the grandeur of the divine punishment. Greek writers, hearing of the event generations later, might have further expanded the scale to enhance the drama. This theory accounts for the complete lack of physical remains. A small group could be swallowed by the desert with little trace. A large army, however, would likely have left behind far more material evidence even after centuries of erosion. Theory 3. The army mutinied or deserted. Some scholars propose that internal tensions within the Persian ranks may have led to mutiny. Cambyses' rule in Egypt was fraught with political strain, and many local soldiers, including Greek mercenaries, may have resisted orders they considered irrational or dangerous. If the army disobeyed the order, split into factions, or attempted to return to the Nile Valley without authorization, Persian political sources might have erased references to the failure to protect the king's prestige. Meanwhile, Egyptian priests may have filled the silence with a story of divine retribution. This theory rests on the notion that armies, like empires, can fracture from within, and that the desert need not have been the direct cause of their disappearance. Theory 4. The army reached Siwa, but was destroyed elsewhere. A more complex theory suggests the troops may have reached the outskirts of Siwa, but encountered resistance from Libyan tribes allied with the oasis. These tribes were skilled warriors and intimately familiar with the terrain. A large Persian force, weakened by its desert journey, may have been ambushed and annihilated. Such a battle could have occurred in a region of shifting sands, where the landscape periodically buries and exposes human remains. Over the centuries, any traces of conflict might have eroded or been scattered by the wind. This scenario would account for both the disappearance of the army and the lack of burial evidence. It also acknowledges the political realities of the region. Siwa and its neighboring tribes were fiercely independent and would not have submitted quietly to Persian aggression. Theory 5. Cambyses never ordered the march at all. This theory challenges the basic premise of Herodotus's account. It argues that Cambyses, though ruthless at times, was not irrational. Sending 50,000 men into the western desert served little strategic purpose. The priests of Siwa posed no military threat to his rule. Moreover, logistical constraints make such an expedition improbable. Proponents of this view suggest that Herodotus may have misunderstood or misrepresented events. Perhaps Cambyses sent diplomats or scouts to Siwa. Perhaps he merely expressed anger toward the oracle, and later storytellers embellished his reaction. In this interpretation, the Lost Army is a legend that evolved from a chain of misunderstandings. Theory 6. The army was destroyed by a sandstorm, but the numbers are true. Finally, the theory closest to Herodotus's own account remains plausible. Historical and meteorological studies confirm that the western desert can generate sandstorms large enough to bury entire groups of people. If an army of tens of thousands marched along a narrow corridor flanked by dunes, a storm of sufficient magnitude could have overwhelmed them. Skeptics argue that at least some remains should have been found, but the desert is immense. Sand can bury a site, dissolve bones, scatter artifacts, or shift over exposed remains until almost nothing recognizable remains. A storm may have sealed the army beneath a dune field that has since migrated, placing their burial site far from any modern search efforts. The absence of evidence is not by itself evidence of absence. Each theory presents its own internal logic and its own weaknesses. None provides a definitive answer. Instead, they form a constellation of possibilities, historical, political, geographical, and environmental, that illuminate different facets of the mystery. What all these theories share is an acknowledgement of how little we truly know. The desert keeps its secrets well. Stories pass through millennia, shift in shape. The motivations of ancient kings filtered through time become harder to discern. In the end, the value of these theories lies not in resolving the mystery, but in deepening our understanding of the world in which it unfolded, a world where empire met the frontier of nature, where oral tradition met historical record, and where human ambition collided with forces far beyond control. And so the mystery remains suspended between history and legend, awaiting the next attempt to interpret the silence of the sands. The Sandstorm Hypothesis. The western desert is a landscape shaped not only by silence, but by motion, a slow, ceaseless breathing of the earth beneath the sky. Dunes creep forward like vast, patient waves. Wind carves new ridges overnight. Plains once flat become broken. Valleys rise, peaks sink, and the entire surface shifts with a rhythm older than recorded history. It is within this ever-changing world that one of the most compelling explanations for the disappearance of Cambyses' army emerges: the Sandstorm Hypothesis. Of all the theories proposed across centuries, this one rests most firmly on tangible, observable forces. It does not rely on myth-making, political propaganda, or human error. Instead, it draws upon geology, climate science, satellite imaging, and the lived experiences of desert travelers, both ancient and modern. To understand the plausibility of a storm large enough to bury an army, one must first understand the nature of the Khamsin, the desert wind that sweeps across North Africa. These winds can travel at astonishing speeds, lifting sand and dust thousands of meters into the air. They roar across the desert with an intensity that obscures the sun scour's exposed skin and reduces visibility to nothing. A person caught inside such a storm may feel as though the desert itself has risen to swallow them. Modern meteorologists studying the Sahara describe sandstorms in terms that evoke both awe and fear, walls of dust stretching hundreds of kilometers, wind gusts surpassing 100 kilometers per hour, temperature spikes that can rise by 20 degrees in minutes, sand grains propelled with enough force to flay fabric, wood, and unprotected skin. In antiquity, such storms were every bit as ferocious and far more dangerous for large, slow-moving groups. If Cambyses' army marched along a route lined with dunes, particularly near the northern edge of the Great Sand Sea, they would have been strikingly vulnerable. Dunes in this region can reach more than 100 meters in height. Their slopes, loose and unstable, become deadly when whipped by powerful winds. A sudden sandstorm could transform a valley between dunes into a funnel of suffocating dust. Some storms come with warning signs: a darkening horizon, a rising hum, a change in the temperature of the air. Others arrive without notice, descending like a curtain pulled across the world. Once inside such a storm, ancient soldiers would have had no recourse. They possessed no goggles, no protective masks, no way to anchor themselves against the wind. The army's animals, camels, donkeys, horses would panic, first breaking ranks, collapsing or fleeing blindly. Supplies would scatter, water would be lost. Torches and signal fires would be extinguished, plunging the camp into disorienting chaos. The larger the army, the greater the vulnerability. A group of 50 could huddle together and wait out a storm. A group of 50,000 could not. Historical accounts from desert explorers offer chilling parallels. In 1805, a caravan of 2,000 people reportedly disappeared near Murzuk after being caught in a violent storm. In the 19th century, European travelers recorded instances of entire camel trains buried beneath dunes that grew over them in the span of a single night. Even in the 20th century, several documented sandstorms have displaced so much sand that small settlements disappeared, later uncovered by shifting winds decades later. The western desert's unique geological features amplify this danger. Beneath its surface lies a complex system of wind corridors, natural channels where storms accelerate with devastating force. Some of these corridors align perfectly with routes the Army may have taken. Satellite imaging reveals dune formations shaped by dominant winds that would have been present in antiquity. These dunes march inexorably west to east, driven by the same wind patterns that Herodotus described. Modern climate reconstructions suggest that the 6th century BC experienced significant atmospheric variability. While precise data is impossible, paleoclimate evidence indicates periods of intense desertification and increased storm activity. A catastrophic storm in such a period would not be unprecedented. Yet the question remains, could a sandstorm truly erase all trace of an entire army? The answer lies in the mechanics of burial. When dunes collapse under high winds, they behave almost like liquid. They pour downward, filling valleys, burying campsites, engulfing tents, weapons, and bodies. The weight of sand compacts quickly, creating layers that protect what lies beneath from scavengers, erosion, and surface disturbance. Over centuries, additional layers accumulate, forming a geological archive tens of meters deep. If Cambyses' soldiers perished at the base of a dune or within a low-lying depression, the storm may have buried them under an avalanche of sand that hardened over time. Subsequent dune migration could then have moved the burial site multiple kilometers from its original location. After 2,500 years, the army could lie beneath a shifting dune field that no archaeologist has ever examined or ever could, given the nature of desert movement. Moreover, the decomposition of organic material in desert conditions accelerates when burial is shallow and slows dramatically when burial is deep. Within a few decades, clothing, textiles, and flesh would have vanished. Bones subjected to extreme temperature cycles would crack, flake, and eventually disintegrate. Metal, particularly bronze, could corrode beyond recognition. Archaeologists searching for the army faced an almost impossible scenario: a burial site that moves, remains that degrade, artifacts scattered by wind and sand. This is why many scholars view the Sandstorm hypothesis as the most compelling explanation. It does not rely on political motives or historical exaggeration. It aligns with everything we know about the Western Desert's capacity for both violence and concealment. Still, even this theory has its uncertainties. No mass grave has been found. No clear datable Persian artifact has surfaced in the relevant regions. No ancient Egyptian or Persian record mentions a sandstorm disaster of such magnitude. If the event took place, the Persians may not have preserved the memory. Empires often erase failures. Egyptian priests may have preserved only the mythic version. And the desert, indifferent to human curiosity, may simply have kept its silence. The sandstorm hypothesis does not resolve the mystery. It only narrows it, focusing attention on a region of the desert where nature overwhelms history. If the army lies buried somewhere beneath the dunes, it remains beyond our reach. And perhaps that is why this theory is both satisfying and haunting. It offers a scenario that fits the evidence, and yet it leaves the mystery intact, guarded by winds that still sweep across the desert as they did 25 centuries ago, vanishing without a trace. The disappearance of Cambyses' army remains one of the most unsettling historical mysteries because it defies the expectations of logic. Armies leave traces. They leave broken weapons, discarded pottery, scattered bones, burned campfires, and the imprint of thousands of feet pressed into the earth. They leave stories and enemy accounts in their own government records, in diplomatic correspondence, in temple inscriptions, or in the memories of survivors. Even when an army falls in battle, something persists: shards of armor, fragments of cloth, a burial site, or the silent testimony of ruins. But the army of Cambyses left nothing. No confirmed artifact, no reliable burial site, no inscription referring to its destruction, no record of survivors, no traceable trail through the desert. To vanish so completely is extraordinary. And yet the Western Desert is a landscape capable of such erasure, a realm that hides what it destroys and destroys what it hides. Understanding how an entire army could disappear requires examining not only what the desert is, but what time itself does to the fragile remains of human activity. The desert as an agent of oblivion. The Western Desert spans millions of square kilometers, an ocean of sand and stone. But unlike water, which preserves and corrodes in equal measure, the desert operates by a different logic. It removes, it strips, it pulverizes, it transports, it buries. Sand blown by the relentless winds behaves like a constant file-grinding surfaces, scouring the finish from metal-reducing bone to chalk and polishing stone into smooth, featureless surfaces. Over centuries, even durable materials can be reduced to unrecognizable fragments. If the army was buried shallowly, the sun and wind would have destroyed most organic traces within decades. If it was buried deeply beneath a collapse of dunes or a sweeping avalanche of sand, the remains might still exist, but far below the reach of modern archaeological tools, entombed under layers of dunes that migrate across the desert's surface like wandering mountains. Dunes are not fixed, they move shift-break and collide. A burial site today might be 10 meters deeper tomorrow or moved several kilometers within a century. Over 2,500 years, dunes can travel astonishing distances. If the army was buried along a dune corridor, its resting place may now lie far from the region researchers consider likely. The desert does not merely hide, it rearranges. Erosion, salt, and temperature. The silent destroyers. The western desert experiences extreme temperature variations. Daytime heat can exceed 45 degrees Celsius, while nighttime temperatures plunge toward freezing. Bones exposed even briefly to these cycles become brittle cracking and splintering until they fragment into dust. Salt, too, plays a role. In certain depressions, salty groundwater seeps upward through capillary action, crystallizing on the surface. This salt corrodes metal faster than moisture alone and accelerates the breakdown of organic materials. If a burial occurred in such a region, artifacts could be obliterated long before modern archaeologists had a chance to seek them. Even stone objects, grinding tools, jar fragments, weapon hafts can crack beneath these pressures. Some ancient environments preserve remains remarkably well, such as the dry tombs of Upper Egypt. But the western desert is an exception. It safeguards nothing on the surface. It only preserves what it buries deep enough, and even then, only if geological conditions are favorable. For an army to vanish, it needed only to fall in a place where sand accumulates faster than it erodes. The rest would follow. The problem of scale searching. Less than 1% of the desert. Despite modern satellite imaging, ground-penetrating radar, and geological mapping, archaeologists have surveyed only a fraction of the vast region where the army may have marched. The possible route spans hundreds of kilometers, including dune fields, gravel plains, and rocky plateaus. Many areas remain inaccessible due to political borders, military zones, or the sheer difficulty of reaching them. And even in accessible regions, the sheer scale poses challenges. A burial site of tens of thousands might seem large in human terms, but in the desert scale becomes distorted. Imagine searching for a ruined campsite the size of a football field buried beneath a sea of dunes the size of a continent. Even with scientific instruments, the odds are low. Complicating matters, the sands obscure even the most promising leads. A scatter of bones could belong to a later caravan. A metal shard might be from Roman, Arab, or Ottoman travelers. Desert trade routes were used for thousands of years. Without inscriptions or unmistakable Persian artifacts, no discovery can be definitively linked to Cambyses. Ancient record-keeping silence where there should be sound. If an army of tens of thousands vanished, why did Persian records not mention it? 3 explanations are often proposed. Persian records from Cambyses' reign are scarce. Many archives from this period have been lost. What survives comes mainly from Babylonian economic tablets, not military logs. Empires suppress their failures. It was common for ancient rulers to omit disasters from official inscriptions. The Persians recorded victories in detail, but defeats were sometimes ignored, erased, or transformed into politically safe narratives. The army may not have been large enough to merit extensive record-keeping. If the expedition was smaller, a detachment rather than a full army, its disappearance would not have left a prominent trace in imperial documents. Egyptian sources also remain silent. The priesthood at Thebes preserved stories of Cambyses' impiety, but no inscription or local record mentions the army's fate. Only the oral tradition remains crystallized later in the writings of Herodotus. In historical mysteries, silence is common. What is unusual here is the combination of silence and scale. The disappearance as a convergence of forces. To vanish without a trace, the army needed a convergence of circumstances, a march through an unstable dune corridor, a catastrophic weather event, a lack of survivors, rapid burial beneath shifting sand, centuries of erosion, scarcity of ancient written accounts, modern exploration covering only a fraction of the terrain. Each factor alone could erase a small group. Together, they could erase much more. The Western Desert is not merely harsh. It is a system built for forgetting. And yet this very completeness of disappearance is what gives the mystery its haunting quality. We expect the past to resist oblivion, to leave clues however faint. But here the earth has chosen to be silent. Somewhere beneath the dunes perhaps lie the quiet remnants of a march that ended in terror. Or perhaps the sands have already ground the last traces into dust, scattering them across the desert until they became indistinguishable from the land itself. The vanished army stands as a reminder that not all history survives. Some stories end not with a monument, but with an absence. Reconstructing the final days. To imagine the final days of Cambyses' lost army is not to dramatize their suffering, but to reconstruct calmly and carefully what conditions they likely faced as they approached the deepest reaches of the Western Desert. There are no eyewitness accounts, no surviving inscriptions, no recovered artifacts. Only fragments of ancient storytelling and the vast, unyielding logic of the desert itself. And yet, by examining the geography, climate, logistics, and cultural context, we can create a plausible picture of how the army's last march unfolded. The soldiers would have left the relative safety of the Nile Valley behind them, stepping into a wilderness that seemed to stretch endlessly westward. For the first few days, the journey may have felt manageable. Their supplies were fresh, their animals were strong. The horizon, though monotonous, was not yet oppressive. But as they advanced deeper into the desert, small problems would have begun to accumulate. The heat grew more intense. Water rationed, carefully evaporated from skins faster than anticipated. The men marched quietly, dust clinging to their clothing, their lips drying their throats, tightening. Officers would have kept strict watch on the pace, ensuring no one strayed from the line. Camels groaned under their burdens. Horses snorted in the heat, lowering their heads to escape the glare of the sun. By the time they reached the first major stretch of unbroken desert, perhaps near Bahariya, perhaps farther south, the land had already begun to press them into submission. The monotony became disorienting. The dunes, rising higher with each day, created an undulating horizon that made navigation increasingly difficult. Guides, even if skilled, would have relied on subtle cues, the color of the sand, the angle of the sun, the memory of landmarks that might now lie buried beneath shifting dunes. If the route passed near the edge of the great sand sea, the scale of the landscape would have been overwhelming. Here dunes tower like mountains, some rising more than 100 meters. Their slopes are soft, their ridges sharp, their movement unpredictable. Marching an army across such terrain is slow, exhausting work. Men sink into the sand with each step, their breaths growing labored. Animals tire quickly, supplies diminish. At night the temperature plummets. Soldiers huddle around small fires, clutching their cloaks against the cold. The winds whisper across the dunes, bringing with them the faintest traces of distant storms. In the darkness the desert feels limitless, a silent sky overhead, a restless earth beneath. Water was the key to survival. The army likely carried enough to traverse a certain number of days, but if a well was dry, if a guide miscalculated a distance, or if the heat drained supplies faster than expected, panic could spread quickly. Dehydration sets in silently. At first a dull headache, dizziness, muscle cramps. Then it becomes acute disorientation. Hallucinations collapse. In such conditions, an army's discipline fractures. Officers struggle to maintain order. Animals falter. Men fall behind. Even without a catastrophic storm, the desert alone could bring an army to its knees. But the most widely supported scenario suggests that the final days were marked not merely by exhaustion, but by a sudden and overwhelming natural event, a sandstorm of extraordinary magnitude. Picture the moment before the storm. The horizon subtly darkens almost imperceptibly at first. The wind, once gentle, begins to rise, carrying grains of sand that sting the skin. The temperature shifts, hot air rushing forward like the breath of a furnace. The animals grow nervous. Soldiers shade their eyes, squinting into the distance. Somewhere in the distance a low rumble grows, a sound that is neither thunder nor wind, but something between the two. Then it comes, not gradually, but as a wall. A Khamsin storm can rise, suddenly bringing blinding sand that swallows the landscape in seconds. Visibility collapses. Men lose sight of one another. Commands are drowned in the roar of the wind. The sun vanishes behind a swirling mass of dust. The world dims. Breath becomes a battle. Sand fills the air so completely that the concept of direction dissolves. East-west, north-south all become meaningless. For soldiers already exhausted and low on water, panic becomes inevitable. Animals bolt. Supply bags tear open their contents, whisked away. The soldiers try to shield their faces, crouching low, but the sand strikes from all angles, a relentless force that grinds everything it touches. In such a storm, dunes can collapse like avalanches. A slope might give way beneath the weight of the wind, pouring downward in waves of sand that bury everything in their path. A valley between dunes, once a shelter, can become a trap. In minutes, an entire column of men could be engulfed, entombed beneath tons of shifting earth. The storm may have lasted hours, perhaps longer. When the winds finally died, the desert would have fallen silent again, the silence of an empty world reshaped. Dunes would have shifted, valleys filled, landmarks erased. If any survivors remained, they would have been scattered, disoriented, and critically dehydrated. None would have made it to Siwa. None would have made it back to the Nile. The final days of the army, then, were likely a slow descent into chaos, punctuated by a sudden catastrophic moment. Exhaustion, thirst, disorientation, followed by violence from the sky. Whether the sandstorm buried the soldiers deeply or left their bodies exposed to the elements, time did the rest. Centuries of erosion broke down bones, metal corroded, wind scattered debris. Dunes migrated, covering and uncovering the landscape repeatedly. What remained of the army merged with the desert itself, lost not only physically, but geologically. Reconstructing the last days is an exercise in empathy as much as history. The soldiers were not mythic figures. They were men, Persians, Medes, Greeks, Egyptians, Arabs, conscripts and volunteers, officers and laborers, each carrying their own fears, hopes, and reasons for marching. Their final moments, whatever form they took, belong to the quiet tragedy of human vulnerability against a landscape that does not forgive mistakes. And so, the story nears its end. Not in revelation, but in reflection. The sands do not reveal what they guard. They shift, they cover, they erase. And somewhere beneath those dunes perhaps lie the final echoes of Cambyses' vanished army, a reminder that some mysteries endure because the earth itself decides to keep them. Echoes beneath the sands. The western desert stretches outward in all directions, its horizons rippling beneath the sun in long, quiet waves. To stand upon one of its high dunes where the wind sweeps softly across the crest and the landscape folds into itself with a vast pale stillness is to feel the strange pull of deep time. It is a place where the boundary between past and present seems almost porous, where the earth carries memories not in monuments or inscriptions, but in silence. Here in this immense shifting wilderness, the story of Cambyses' lost army lingers like a faint echo. Nothing visible marks their passage, no scattered armor, no wind-swept bones, no abandoned weapons half buried in the dunes. And yet the legend endures not as a solved equation, but as a mystery that has woven itself into the imagination of generations. The desert does not yield answers easily. It keeps its stories beneath layers of sand wrapped in the slow, inexorable movement of geological time. Every dune that rises was once part of another, carried grain by grain from distant valleys. Every hollow that opens was once sealed beneath drifting ridges. In this ceaseless transformation, the truth of the lost army's fate may lie concealed, not lost by accident, but hidden by the nature of the land itself. The idea of disappearance unsettles us. Human memory clings to the belief that events, especially large and dramatic ones, must leave traces. We expect that catastrophe will mark the world physically, that destruction will carve scars into the earth, that tragedy will leave remains for later generations to uncover. But the desert challenges this assumption. It offers no promises. It is a realm where time does not preserve, it erases. It is this erasure that gives the story such power. Herodotus, hearing tales from Egyptian priests nearly a century after the event, captured not the precise facts, but the emotional resonance: an army swallowed by a storm, a king defied by the gods, a cautionary tale etched into collective memory. Later, historians debated the accuracy of his account, questioning the number of soldiers, the purpose of the march, and the reliability of his sources. Explorers combed the desert in search of evidence. Archaeologists mapped routes and examined dry wells. Geologists traced ancient wind patterns, seeking clues in the movements of dunes. And yet nothing conclusive surfaced. Perhaps the army truly marched into the desert only to be overtaken by a storm so fierce that the sands buried them beyond recovery. Perhaps the force was much smaller and met its end quietly dying one by one of thirst and heat, their remains scattered so widely that no modern search could identify them. Perhaps the episode was exaggerated by priests seeking to cast Cambyses in a terrible light. Or perhaps the entire story is a myth born from cultural memory, rooted in political tension, rather than historical fact. Each possibility holds its own logic. Each offers a different lens through which to view the past. But none displaces the core of the mystery, the silence of the desert, where an army should have stood. As modern technology advances, new methods continue to refine how we search for what the Earth has hidden. Satellite imagery reveals subtle variations in surface texture, hinting at depressions or structures long buried. Ground-penetrating radar can uncover layers beneath the sand without disturbing the surface. Climate modeling reconstructs ancient wind cycles and storm frequencies. All these tools promise new insights, yet even with them, the western desert remains elusive. For every answer science uncovers, the desert provides new questions. There is a certain calmness in this, a reminder that not all mysteries exist to be solved. Some exist to expand our perspective, to remind us of the limits of our knowledge, and to deepen our respect for forces greater than ourselves. The Lost Army of Cambyses is one such mystery, a narrative woven not just through history, but through geology, climate politics, and the fragility of human endeavor. In the quiet hours of evening, as the dunes cool and the winds soften, the desert changes character. Shadows grow long across the sand. The sky deepens from gold to violet. A stillness settles that feels ancient, as though the land is remembering something distant. It is in this moment that one can imagine the faint echoes of footsteps, long vanished of voices, carried away by the wind of a tragedy preserved only in the imagination of those who came after. The army's disappearance may never be explained in full. The sands have likely scattered their remains beyond recognition, or buried them beyond reach, or worn them to dust. But the absence has become its own kind of presence, a reminder of the scale of the desert, the vulnerability of human ambition, and the fragility of memory. What endures, then, is not the army itself, but the story. The image of men marching into the vastness, the whisper of a storm rising in the distance, the sudden darkness beneath a wall of swirling sand, the silence that followed. For more than 25 centuries, the tale has traveled from mouth to ear, from epoch to epoch, enduring not because it offers certainty, but because it leaves room for wonder. It invites each generation to contemplate what lies beneath the sands, not only in a literal sense, but in the deeper landscape of human history, where memory fades and nature decides what is remembered. Perhaps one day, a shifting dune will reveal something unexpected, a fragment of bronze, the curve of a skull, a weapon-bearing Persian craftsmanship. Perhaps not. The desert is unpredictable, and its secrets are its own. Until then, the fate of the Lost Army of Cambyses remains suspended between legend and history, a quiet enigma guarded by dunes that drift like slow-moving waves across an ancient sea. And as long as the desert endures, the mystery will endure with it, a soft echo beneath the sands carried by the wind across an endless horizon.